Death at Bishop's Keep, Chapter 42. Que bono? Who benefits? Cicero. Dr. Randall turned from the sheet-covered figure, his face somber. I want to see all the servants in the library. You too, Miss Audley. There must be a thorough examination. Kate smoothed the sheet. An examination? But why? She asked wearily. Her chest was heavy with sadness and her eyes were blurred with tears. Why? The doctor's white whiskers bristled, and Kate realized that he was holding on to his composure with some difficulty. The disease that killed your aunt may be contagious, that's why. We may have to quarantine this place. He waved his arm like an irate bandmaster. Assemble the servants, please. A half-hour later, having looked into throats, taken pulses, temperatures, and examined eyes and tongues, and listened to hearts and lungs with his stethoscopes, Dr. Randall dismissed the others and kept Kate behind. He wore a look that Kate, nearly overwhelmed by shock and grief, could not truly decipher. If we are dealing with the disease, he said, going to stand in front of the fire, there's no evidence of it. Thank God for that, Kate replied fervently. She sat down in the Morris chair, shivering. It would be terrible if the others were to suffer as my aunt suffered this morning. Her muscles felt stiff and sore, her throat hurt, and her head was throbbing. But it was grief that afflicted her most, not illness. She had not had much love for Aunt Jaggers, but they were relatives, and she could not wish her dead. As for Aunt Sabrina, Kate covered her face with her hands. She loved and admired Aunt Sabrina. It had been dreadful to sit helplessly at her bed, watching her slip farther and farther away into a place from which there could be no return. And this death had brought memories of another. When Kate's mother died of measles so many years ago, that aching void in her heart, so long covered over, seemed opened again by the death of her aunt. Dr. Randall cleared his throat, and Kate looked up. I have confidence in my examination, he said gently, but I suggest that the servants not be allowed to leave the house for any lengthy period of time, in case the symptoms should manifest later. He looked down at the fire. I fear, he added uncomfortably, that another question must now be addressed. Yes, Kate said, trying to keep her voice steady. My aunts are dead, if not by illness. How? That exactly. The doctor shifted his weight. The circumstances, Miss Audley, are definitely suspicious. Miss Jaggers mentioned poison. Kate stared at him. But she was hysterical. You said so yourself. And I thought so, the doctor said somberly. But the alternatives, I fear, are not limitless. Kate pulled in her breath sharply. The doctor looked at her as if gauging her ability to hear his next question without going to pieces. Do you know of anyone who might wish your aunts dead? Any enemies? Kate closed her eyes. She could feel the laughter rising hysterically in her throat. Enemies? Her shoulders shook and a wild giggle threatened to escape her. Everyone in the house had been an enemy of someone else in the house. The doctor put a beefy hand on her shoulder. Steady on, Miss Audley, he said in a fatherly way. He turned to his bag and took out a flask. Here, he said, unscrewing the cap and pouring an amber liquid into a small cup. Have a swallow of this. Kate gulped down the whiskey that he offered and sat still for a moment, letting the heat of it warm and steady her. The doctor helped himself to a sizable swallow and then another, and capped the flask and replaced it in his bag. I'm afraid it will be painful to speak to the constable about this matter, but he must be summoned to interview the servants while events are fresh in their minds. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. There's sure to be a coroner's inquest. Kate nodded numbly. And both your aunts. His look was sympathetic. Both must be autopsies, I fear. I do not have enough evidence to certify a specific cause of death. I understand, Kate said. I will see to summoning the constable. Thank you. Kate sat still while the doctor opened the door and went in search of Mud. The doctor gone, the library seemed appallingly vacant. The chair, the lamp seemed to wait for Aunt Sabrina, and the things on her desk, her pen, her notes, even the vase of autumn asters, now seemed like ghost shadows, shades of her. In some indiscernible, undefiable way, Kate felt the impossibility of separating her aunt from the things she loved and lived with, and could not help but believe, though she knew it was not so, that at any moment Aunt Sabrina would open the door and come in. But the only person to enter was Amelia, who brought an inquiry from Mrs. Farnsworth by messenger concerning a certain person who was supposed to be a member of the London Temple. Kate looked up the information and gave it to Amelia for the messenger, together with a brief note of unsteadily writing informing Mrs. Farnsworth of her aunt's death. Mercifully, Kate did not have long to wait for the constable's arrival. At 3:30, she heard the crunch of gravel outside and opened the French doors to look out. The constable had arrived on a bicycle. She went back to her chair in front of the fire, and after a few minutes, the doctor brought him into the library. "This is Constable Edward Lakin, Mrs. Ardley," Dr. Randall said. "I have informed him of the circumstances of your aunt's death." He spoke slowly and gently, as if he were speaking to a child. Did he think her bereavement somehow made her more fragile? Or did he fear that, confronted by the constable, or the need to consider the cause of her aunt's death, that she would fly into hysterics? He picked up his bag and went to the door. "I must see to other patients," he said in a comforting voice, "but I leave you in capable hands. Do not hesitate to send for me if there is need." "Thank you," Kate said. When the doctor had gone, she turned to the constable. "I'm sure you have questions," she said, steadying her voice, but keeping it low. "I fear so, Miss Ardley." The constable was a slender man with sandy hair and a ruddily thoughtful face and alert grey eyes. His navy serge uniform was brushed, its buttons polished, and his boots shined. "I'm sorry to intrude on your grief, but if the questions are answered now, perhaps there will be no need for further intrusion." His voice was well modulated and suggested an education beyond that of the village school. "Please, ask what you must," Kate said, by of the fire. Aunt Sabrina's shawl was hanging over the arm of the chair. She fingered it for a moment, then draped it around her shoulders. "Do you wish to speak to the servants?" "Yes, ma'am," the constable said, "but I have several questions for you first, if I may." Kate saw that the constable's level gaze held a certain regard, but something of the defensive as well. Remembering that her policeman uncle had often felt himself scorned by the upper class, Kate understood the look. But it would not make the man easier to know that she herself came from a policeman's family and sympathized with his situation. So she only said, "I'll answer what I can." Acting with deference and authority at once, the constable took a notebook and a pencil out from his pocket. He wrote down the names of her aunts, the names and approximate ages of the servants, and the length of their service, as well as her own name. She described her relationship to her aunts and her position at Bishop's Keep, and saw as she did a slight shift in his posture. He looked up. "You are employed here as well as related." "Yes," Kate said. "My aunt was engaged in a work that required typing and other clerical duties, which I provided." She paused, wondering what she should say on the difficulties of the past few days. She was about to mention the situation when Constable Lakin spoke again. "I understood that Miss Ardley had no relatives other than her sister, and yourself, of course." Kate hesitated. In her delirium, Aunt Sabrina had spoken of a child, but Dr. Randall had vigorously rejected the idea. Aunt Sabrina's words, her last words, echoed in her mind. "You are the last Ardley." "I believe that is the case," she said. "Who benefits from the death?" the constable asked. Her eyes widened. "Sir? Who inherits the estate?" His tone was sturdily offhand. "I do not know," Kate said. It was not a question she wanted to think about right now. "I understand that the vicar has a copy of my aunt's will. Perhaps he could provide you with the name of her solicitor." Constable Lakin pocketed his notebook. "I'll speak with him. Might I see the servants now, Miss Ardley?" His eyes were guarded. "Privately, if you please. That is, without you or the butler present." Kate was momentarily taken aback. Did he think she might influence their answers? Did he imagine that she or Maud might wish the servants to conceal some fact that might have been bearing on her aunt's death? But no doubt it was better this way. He would learn of the below-stairs animosity from the servants themselves. She bit her lip, remembering that more than one of them had a good reason to want Aunt Jaggers dead. "Of course," she said. She rang the bell for Mutt. He opened the door instantly, a silver tray in his hand. "I was about to knock, Miss Ardley." He extended the tray with a card. "I've asked the gentleman to wait in the drawing room." "Thank you," Kate said, taking a card. "Constable Lakin wishes to interview the staff." Feeling diffident about acting the part of mistress, even though she knew it was expected of her, she added, "Would you please take him to the servants' hall and assemble them there?" She glanced at the card and saw with surprise that it was Sir Charles. "And please ask Amelia to show the gentleman in." "Yes, ma'am," Maud said. He gave the constable a disdainful glance and preceded him through the door. A moment later Sir Charles came into the room. "My dear Miss Ardley," he said, with a look of such sympathy that Kate felt nearly undone. "I am so sorry. What an awful thing, unimaginable." He spoke almost awkwardly, as if the words were not adequate to his feelings. His eyes were on hers, warm with concern. "Are you well?" "Yes, thank you, Sir Charles." Kate felt the blood coming to her face and an unaccustomed confusion inside of her. She looked away quickly, gestured to the chair on the other side of the fire. "Please sit down. I'm sorry I cannot offer you tea, but the servants are otherwise engaged just now. The constable is with them." He sat down on the edge of the chair, still looking at her. "I didn't know until I came. That is, I did not know of your trouble. I merely called to leave the photographs I took yesterday as promised." He took an envelope out of his pocket and put it on the table beside the chair. "The constable, does that suggest—" "Dr. Randall does not know the cause of the death. There will be autopsies and a coroner's inquest. The doctor suggested that the constable be summoned immediately, and I thought it best to take his advice. I'm sure this inquiry is simply routine." Kate shivered, pulling the shawl closer. She might speak lightly of the inquiry to Sir Charles, but she was perfectly aware of its significance. The constable was a perceptive man. Even if Mrs. Pratt and Mott were not forthcoming in their answers, he would certainly sense their bitter enmity toward Aunt Jaggers and their resentment toward Aunt Sabrina. Kate did not think she could bring herself to believe that either the cook or the butler could have gone to such awful lengths for mere revenge. But the constable might think differently. She shivered again. Perhaps she should have insisted on being present when he spoke with them. It was gradually dawning on her that until the matter of the estate was settled, all authority for the household rested upon her shoulders. She was responsible for the servants' welfare. Sir Charles cleared his throat. "I take it, then, that the doctor has ruled out food poisoning." Kate returned her attention to the conversation. He seemed to doubt it, since neither was taken sick until this very morning. Had it been food poisoning, he said, the symptoms would have appeared earlier. In any event, the three of us shared the same table last night. Kate stopped abruptly, struck by a thought. They had shared the same table, yes, but they had not eaten the same food. Aunt Jaggers and Aunt Sabrina had consumed the pudding. She had eaten only the soup and fricassee left from luncheon. Sir Charles leaned forward, watching her face. "What have you thought of, Miss Ardley?" "My two aunts ate something I did not," Kate said slowly. "A pudding." "What sort of pudding?" "A mushroom pudding." Sir Charles' eyes were intent. "What were the symptoms of their illnesses?" When Kate told him, he stood up abruptly. "There is a line of inquiry I must pursue." Kate stared at him. Was there something about the mushroom pudding? Was it possible that— She rose. "What line of inquiry?" In answer, Sir Charles half turned toward the door. "I must speak with your cook," he said. "She is with Constable Lakin." Kate frowned. "Please tell me, Sir Charles," she said with greater distinctness, "what line of inquiry you aim to pursue." But again he did not answer. "Lakin?" he inquired with great interest. Do you refer to Edward Lakin?" "I believe that is his name," Kate acknowledged, but she was not to be put off. Was this man so arrogant that he would refuse outright to answer her question? She put her hand on his arm. "This inquiry, Sir Charles," she said for the third time, now with urgency. "What is it you think has happened?" He stared down at her hand, then up at her face, taken aback. He felt himself flush. "I fear it would not be appropriate to discuss my suspicions at this time. Kate pulled her hand back. "Not appropriate!" she exclaimed. "My aunts have died of an unknown cause, and you talk of hypotheses. Sir Charles, I find your behavior most appallingly." "Forgive me for intruding," said a voice, thin and trembling. The vicar stood in the open library door, his hair a wild silver halo, his face ashen. "And for admitting myself. I came as soon as I heard. To offer comfort." "Of course," Kate said, feeling a rush of sympathy for the old man. He looked as if he had greater need of comfort than she. "I am very glad that you did. Please come in and sit down by the fire." Aunt Sabrina had had a special affection for him, and he must be feeling her death very deeply. Sir Charles bowed to the vicar and then turned to Kate. "I will not trouble you any further, Miss Ardley. I can find my way to the servants' hall." "But I want to know—" Kate began angrily, then stopped. She might compel Sir Charles to tell her what she was thinking, and she could certainly detain him until she could accompany him to the servants' hall. But compassion required her to talk with the vicar at once, and besides, Aunt Sabrina had entrusted her with a private message to the vicar that was not for other ears. She raised her chin with a look of sharp displeasure. "Good day, then, Sir Charles," she said coldly. The figure sank down in the chair as Sir Charles hurriedly left the room. He shook his head and dropped his face in his hands. "Death becomes harder and harder to bear," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "But this one is hardest of all. Oh, my poor dear Sabrina."